Hello and welcome to a revision session looking at the League of Nations and its successes and failures. And we're going to break this into two sections. So we're going to start by thinking about the League of Nations in the 1920s and its successes and failures. Was it a total failure? And then we're going to look at the League of Nations in the 1930s and think in particular about why it did fail in the 1930s, ultimately 1939 when the outbreak of World War II happens. So to start with, let's reflect on the League of Nations in the 1920s. Is it a total failure? Well, the answer is no, it's not a total failure. Some of the biggest successes of the League of Nations, however, are not to do with its peacekeeping, but to do with its work with the special commissions. And if you remember, the special commissions they're like groups or organisations who aimed to help to improve the world in other ways. So, for example, WHO, or the World Health Organization, was set up by the League of Nations, and that still exists today and does some really important work. And in the 1920s, it was focusing on campaigning to do things like to stop the spread of yellow fever and malaria. We've also got something called the ILO, or the International Labour Organization. So it's another group that was set up by the League of Nations, and their job was to try and help to improve working conditions for people all the way around the world. And they did have some major successes. So, for example, in 1928, 77 countries decided to set a minimum wage for workers to try and stop their exploitation. So that was a real success. And we've also got the Slavery Commission. So the Slavery Commission's job was to try and stop the spread of slavery around the world, or to kind of free people who were in slavery. And in particular, Sierra Leone was a real success story for the Slavery Commission of the League of Nations. So in 1927, they managed to get Sierra Leone to completely abolish slavery, and they freed around 200,000 people who were in slavery in that country. And also, finally, the Transport Commission, although there are a number of different ones, but this is another good example of a success of special commissions. So the Transport Special Commission decided to set international highway codes for people around the world, so that all drivers would follow the same rules, which meant that if you travel to another country and then try to use a vehicle, there'd be much less likelihood of traffic accidents because you'd all be following the same set of rules. So all of those things are some really good examples of successes of the special commissions. But they're not the only successes. There are some other ones as well. So in particular, we've got the Åland Islands, also spelt sometimes. So we sometimes have A with a little dot over the top of it, or you can spell it with a double A at the beginning instead. So they're Ireland or the Åland Islands. So this set of islands is sort of between Finland and Sweden. And there was a discussion or kind of increasing tensions in the 1920s over the Åland Islands because both Sweden and Finland wanted them. And the League of Nations stepped in and they did a report, and they decided that Finland should have the islands so long as Finland made sure that those islands remained demilitarised. They didn't have any forts on them, they weren't keeping any soldiers on them, and that way Sweden wouldn't feel threatened in any way by Finland owning those islands. And Sweden was very happy with that, and Finland was very happy with that as well. So that's a real success, isn't it? Except that there is a limitation to this, and that is that both Sweden and Finland actually went to the League of Nations to ask them for help in the first place. So in that way, although it is a success story, it's limited success because both countries were clearly willing to compromise before they'd even gone to the League of Nations. And then finally, we've got in 1926, the Locarno Treaty is signed and Germany is allowed into the League of Nations for the first time. And that is a success. It means that they're involving Germany, and hopefully that would be important in a peacekeeping organisation way. But obviously it's got limited success in the long run. So now if we reflect, obviously we've had some limited successes, mainly with special commissions, less so with keeping peace. Let's have a look at our evidence of failures in the 1920s of the League of Nations. So there are lots, as you can see. If we're looking at peacekeeping, some of our best examples of failures are Upper Silesia, Vilna, and Bulgaria. So Upper Silesia is an area of land that both Germany and Poland wanted, and it had been split, and there was a discussion going on about who should have it in 1921. So the League of Nations decided to hold a plebiscite or a vote, which sounds like a brilliant idea because the people who were actually living in Upper Silesia would decide where to live. The problem is that there was a fair split here. So 60% of the people in Upper Silesia wanted to be part of Germany and 40% wanted to be part of Poland. And that was quite tricky. So the League of Nations tried to appease everyone. So they split the land, and Germany got more of the land, so they got 2/3 of the land, but mostly rural areas, and Poland got mostly towns and industrial areas, but they only got 1/3 of the land. And the problem with this is that led to quite a lot of tension between Poland and Germany, which didn't really go away, and ultimately we also know that Germany ends up invading Poland in 1939, though that's probably not the only reason for it. The actions of the League of Nations it avoided a war, but it didn't avoid tension between those two countries. It didn't really resolve the issue. It didn't have the same successes that the Ireland Islands did. Two examples of much bigger failures of the League of Nations, I suppose, would be Vilna and Corfu, which we haven't highlighted yet. So I'll just highlight Corfu for you on here so you can see it as well. So Corfu's up here. Okay, so Vilna and Corfu are bigger failures. Vilna is a crisis that happens in 1920. Poland invaded Vilna, which was Lithuania's capital city, and the League of Nations told Poland that they should leave. Poland refused, and then the League of Nations couldn't actually do anything about it because they didn't have an army or any way of enforcing their rules. And in fact, some key members were unwilling to support it. So France saw Poland as a potential ally, so they weren't going to be willing to step in and sanction them in any way, and they're a key member of the League of Nations. And Britain also didn't want to send an army in because they just saw it as much too expensive. It's only 2 years, if that, after the end of World War One. So that's a real failure of the League of Nations. And Italy invaded Corfu in 1923, which is another major failure of the League of Nations. Italy is a key member of the League of Nations, so they should have been upholding peace. And although eventually Italy did withdraw their troops, they still managed to force Greece, who they had invaded, to pay compensation to them for an army general of theirs that they had lost. That brings us on to a, let's say, more minor failure. So it's slightly less of a failure, which is Bulgaria down here. So Bulgaria was invaded by Greece. Greece claimed that one of their Greek soldiers had been killed by Bulgarian soldiers, and they used that as justification to invade Bulgaria. But the League of Nations did force Greece to withdraw. And this is sort of between success and failure for a reason. So, in a way, the League of Nations is successful. They did manage to make Greece leave Bulgaria, because Greece was a much less powerful country than Italy and other countries that they were trying to sanction. But it was also not a great success because it showed that the League of Nations were only going to enforce their rules on weaker countries, because Italy had literally just got away with invading Corfu and hadn't been sanctioned in any way, whereas Greece ends up being quite heavily sanctioned for their invasion of Bulgaria. Unfortunately, that's not the end of all our failures that we're going to have a look at. So other failures, and a real key one here, is the constitution, or the organisation and structure of the League of Nations itself. So all members of the council had the power of veto. So all 42 or over 50 eventually countries who were members of the assembly could veto an agreement if they wanted to. And the assembly only met once a year to discuss things, so it was really quite slow to do anything. There were only 4 permanent members who met more frequently, as members of the council. And we also got the Court of International Justice, which sounds really powerful. It had 11 judges from all sorts of different countries, but it had no army, it had no way of actually enforcing the sanctions it was putting in place. We've also got evidence that the power of veto was quite unsuccessful. So, for example, we know that an attempt to stop child labour was vetoed in 1919, so not great. And attempts to stop the sale of opium failed because of the power of veto, because lots of countries were actually making money from the sale of drugs like opium. And we also know that Germany vetoed, although it's later on actually, but Germany vetoed help being sent to Jewish refugees in Germany as well. So in that way, special commissions and the constitution itself was quite unsuccessful. We've also already mentioned that the League of Nations, kind of the key members, are undermining themselves in the 1920s. So Italy, as we've seen, invading Corfu. France had invaded Germany. They'd invaded just the Rhineland or the Ruhr area in the left of Germany and seized goods from them when they had not kept up with their repayments of reparations in 1923. And Britain, although it openly said that it was a real supporter of the League of Nations and had issued a memorandum, or kind of like a sort of document called the Fontainebleau Memorandum, saying that it was fully behind the League of Nations in the 1920s, it was actually mainly part of the League of Nations because it thought it could gain something from it. It was hoping to gain colonies, which it did from Germany and from other countries where they'd been confiscated. So, was the League of Nations a success in the 1920s? I'd say it was a limited success. Its main successes were in the special commissions and what they managed to succeed in achieving. In terms of peacekeeping, the Åland Islands and Bulgaria, those events had limited success. But really, there were some major failures, including lack of support of key members of the League, Upper Silesia and Vilna and Corfu, which didn't really go to plan. In the 1930s, it's much easier to make a judgment here. There are no major successes at all, really, for the League of Nations. It's mainly just failures. So, key failures of the League of Nations in the 1930s. The Constitution didn't have an army, and the power of veto prevented the special commissions from really being very successful in this period. So only one country had to say no, and then the whole changes stopped. So, for example, Germany, like we've mentioned, blocked help for Jewish refugees in 1933. In terms of membership, there are some key problems. Germany left in 1933 when they refused to join the disarmament conference, and there were no real sanctions for this. The USA was still not a member, so economic sanctions were very limited. They couldn't really achieve very much with them. And key members of the League ultimately openly broke the terms of the League of Nations themselves, which really undermined the League of Nations. The Manchurian crisis, when when Japan invaded Manchuria in China in 1931 to 32. The League of Nations took a year to write the Lytton Report, and then Japan just leaves the League of Nations in 1933 and invades Yuan, and then invades the rest of China by 1937. That's a key member of the League of Nations, one of the 4 permanent members of the Council. Abyssinia, Italy invades. That's really openly breaking the terms of the League of Nations for a second time, because they've already done it in Corfu in the 1920s. And the Hall of Al Pact, which was signed by Britain, France and Italy, the 3 remaining key members of the Council of the League of Nations, gets leaked to the press, so everyone around the world can see that actually the League of Nations can't really be relied on, because when it's to their benefit, they're breaking their own rules. And the Great Depression also made it very difficult for the League of Nations to be successful in this period. They had no way to control the extreme parties who were sort of popping up all over the place in the 1930s. The Financial Commission was completely unable to cope with the problems, and it also led to the policy of appeasement being followed by countries like Britain, who were doing everything in their power to try and avoid another expensive war. So the League of Nations was a total failure in the 1930s. So let's have a quick look at a potential 16-mark question. So this one says the main reason that the League of Nations failed to avoid or avert war in 1939 was the Great Depression. So the main reason that it failed to avoid war or avert war in 1939 was the Great Depression. How far do you agree? So this is looking at the causes of the failure of the League of Nations to avoid war. So obviously, in a way, the Great Depression was a cause of the failure of the League of Nations to avoid war. Part of that is that the League of Nations members were less likely to support it with economic sanctions and things like that because they couldn't afford the loss of trade after the Great Depression. So, for example, Britain was more happy to appease Germany to do things like sign the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, allowing them to slightly increase the amount of boats in their navy to only 35% the size of Britain's and 45% of their submarines and things like that. And they enabled them to do those things because they were worried that they didn't want to lose a trading partner in Germany. They wanted to enable them to be successful. And we could also argue that the rise of extreme parties that happens with groups that want colonial expansion into other countries of raw materials, all those things do actually happen as a result of the Great Depression. For example, Japan wants to invade Manchuria because their silk is worthless. It's sort of dropped to sort of a fifth of its original value, and they're looking for an area of land that's rich in raw materials that they might be able to use to make money. Abyssinia is invaded by Italy because, oh yes, okay, partly it's next to the Italian Somaliland and Eritrea, but it's because that area of land again is rich in farmland and raw materials, and they need money because of the Great Depression. Austria is wanted by Germany partly because of the Great Depression, and the Sudetenland in particular is wanted because it's rich in raw materials and it would really benefit Germany during the Great Depression. So in that way, the Great Depression certainly fuels the desire of many countries to invade other countries, which ultimately prevents peace and helps to cause war in 1939. However, it could be argued that actually a more important cause of the failure of the League of Nations to avoid war in 1939 is that key members of the League of Nations undermined the League of Nations' power. It made the League of Nations look weak, which meant that countries were happy to break the terms and invade other countries because they felt nothing would happen to them. And the best examples we got of this are Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Japan was a key permanent member of the Council of the League of Nations. There's only 4 permanent members: Japan, Italy, France and Britain. And by breaking openly the terms of the League of Nations in 1931 and then leaving the League of Nations, ignoring the sanctions in 1933 and then invading the rest of China by 1937 to 1938, it really undermines the League of Nations' power. Italy, also a key member of the League, does the same kind of thing. So their invasion of Corfu in 1923 made the League of Nations look weak. Their invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, in particular because of the leak to the press of the Hall-Laval Pact, makes Italy, France and Britain all look like they're massively undermining the League of Nations' power. It's the remaining key members of the Council of the League of Nations, and they're all totally ignoring what the League of Nations stands for because they can gain something personally from it. And that being leaked to the press led to things like the USSR turning to the Nazi-Soviet pact, without which Hitler couldn't invade Poland. So war wouldn't have happened in 1939 because Hitler wouldn't have been able to fight a war on 2 fronts. So in that way, key members of the League of Nations undermining its power were a really important cause of the outbreak of war in 1939 and the League of Nations' failure to avoid that. Britain's policy of appeasement gave Hitler access to things like the Skoda factory in the Sudetenland, and the Munich Agreement demilitarising the Sudetenland made his victory really easy. It may not have been possible without those things. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement as well. All of these things, this policy of appeasement, massively undermined the work of the League of Nations because they were basically giving areas of land to Hitler. They're only doing it to slightly delay war because they're not ready for war themselves. Another really important reason that the League of Nations was really failed to avoid war, which is again more important than the Great Depression, is its structure or its constitution, the way it's set up. The International Court of Justice, with 11 judges and no army, it's really hard to enforce any rulings. Japan left the League of Nations after Lord Lytton's report to the International Court of Justice in 1933 and just carried on invading China, which encouraged other people to do the same thing. The USA was never a member, so economic sanctions were really ineffective, and they didn't even bother using them against Italy in 1935 because they knew they'd have such a limited effect. Finally, Hitler and Stalin, and sort of other key leaders. So Hitler and Stalin did play a role in causing the failure of the League of Nations, but I think less important than the Great Depression. One of the key reasons why extreme leaders like Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini were in power in the 1930s is because of the Great Depression. But you could still argue that they played a role in the failure of the League of Nations to avert war. Hitler did remilitarise Germany, and he uses plebiscites and things like that for the Saar and for Anschluss to strengthen Germany and make it possible for Germany to get to a position where they could invade other countries again. The Nazi murder of Dollfuss, the Dollfuss affair, and intimidation of Schuschnigg enabled Anschluss as well. Again, that strengthens it. However, Hitler's not as important as the causes of the Great Depression because those things on their own didn't actually make Germany strong enough to withstand military retaliation, and they could have been stopped if other countries had stepped in. So if key members had stepped in, then I think actually it's not such an important cause. And Stalin signing the Nazi-Soviet pact, again, although that made it possible for Hitler to invade Poland, and as far as they wouldn't have a war on two fronts, if they had been prevented from remilitarising Germany in the first place, then Germany still wouldn't be in a position to invade Poland or to start war up. So in that way, the main reason the League of Nations failed to avoid war in 1939 is really key members undermining the League of Nations' power, and the Great Depression making it less likely that members would support the League of Nations in its international sanctions, and with their armies and things like that. So yes, in a way, to a limited extent, the Great Depression was a cause of the League of Nations failure, but the most important one is that key members undermined the League of Nations power, and without that, there wouldn't have been a World War II. Best of luck with your revision.